Good morning, everyone. I am excited to be back with you today. Hopefully, we have some repeats, and for the listeners who are going to be tuning into the recording, hopefully you'll be able to listen to the first session and the subsequent sessions as well. So my name is Megan Pollock. I am based out of a small town in Texas, Southeast Texas. And as Brittany said, this is the Engineer Inclusion Series, and that's the name of my company. And I come to this work as an engineer. And so the series today is really focused on understanding the barriers, the top 10 root causes and barriers for women in STEM. And it's not only my professional expertise, given what I've studied in my doctoral work, but it's my lived experience too. So my background is in computer science and engineering. I worked as an engineer for Texas Instruments before switching from widgets to workshops and really transforming the direction of my career with the goal of creating cultures and climates of inclusion and belonging so that more women and people of color can feel valued, included, and affirmed, and can choose the pathways within engineering and STEM as well. So I want to introduce you to my colleague Elizabeth. She is going to be in the chat helping us to kind of stay organized. She's going to share some resources with you. And so if you have any questions, you can ask Elizabeth. And if I miss something in the chat, then she'll be able to help me get caught up. So as Brittany suggested, this is a series, and this is the second workshop in the series. So last time we talked about understanding that there are root causes for women in STEM and other non-traditional pathways. But today we're really focusing on those top 10 root causes. Like if we were to do a root cause analysis, which is what we talked about last time, the root cause analysis would likely reveal one of the 10 things that we're going to talk about today. And this is based on the research and then framed within a tool that I use to help people learn this. And so you're going to get to take that away today. And then we've got a couple of more events coming up. On March 5th, we'll have an open discussion. And then March 12th, we'll talk about specific strategies for engineering inclusion and belonging. So our agenda today is we've got the first hour. I'll have some interactive elements using Slido, but for the most part, I'm going to have, based on the participation that we had last time, I'm going to present the content, and then we'll have a half an hour for discussion. And so if you've got specific scenarios that you're trying to solve within your sphere of influence, we can talk about that in the last half hour. And so I encourage you to ask questions throughout. You don't have to hold your questions by any means. But for the sake of those people who are like, I have an hour and I've got to drop off after that, we're going to sort of schedule it in this way. I also really like to remind people before we dive into any kind of learning opportunity that it's really important and valuable for us to think about what is it that we can control? What is it that we can influence? And what are those things that we care about, that we're concerned about, but we can't change anything about those things? And so when we're going to make progress in this space, when we focus on those things that we can control and that we can influence, rather than those things that we can't. So it's really easy to sort of get stuck, especially when we're talking about sort of systems of advantage and disadvantage. It can be a little overwhelming, and we can think about all the things, all the barriers for success. But we want to reel ourselves in to recognize, what can I control, what can I influence, and what can I do to lead and facilitate change moving forward. And so I want to encourage you to keep this in mind as we're learning together. So as I suggested, we're going to be using Slido today to have some engagement from the audience. And so if you've never used it, you can either go to your browser to go to slido.com and enter in the number there, or you can open up your smartphone, open up the camera, and then hit the QR code and open up that browser. And it's going to be the same QR code throughout the day. So you don't have to keep scanning the QR code. It will just refresh as we go along. So to help me kind of understand the audience, if you can do a really quick poll here and to select which best describes you. This will help me better sort of design the sort of examples and scenarios that I'm going to share with you today. So I've got some pre-college options, some uh, college options if you're from industry, and if you're something else that's not listed here, if none of this describes you, then I encourage you to click other and then tell me what might better describe you in the chat. So we've got a couple of people participating, and you all are serving as college administrators. Um, all right, so we've got a few people. All right, so we've got definitely a bit of a critical mass around college administration. Excellent. Okay, so you're gonna hear me use the term non-traditional throughout the day. Even though we're focused specifically on women in STEM, this is still the federal term that we use to help distinguish these things. And so the literature and the research that we're going to be referring to is really applicable to any non-traditional career pathway. And so non-traditional careers are any in which one gender represents less than 25% of the workforce. So, for example, women in engineering or men in nursing. But many of these jobs, many of these careers are high wage and high demand. And so it's imperative that we remove those barriers and increase the participation and completion of women and men in these non-traditional pathways. And so this workshop is designed, or this talk is designed to equip you with tools and strategies for thinking about those barriers so that we can begin to reduce them and allow for more access and success. Um, so I want to first get you to sort of think about and sort of prime your brain. What are some of those barriers to access and success for women in STEM? What are some of those barriers to access and success for women in STEM? Whether they're entering into and persisting in these pathways. When you think about barriers, what is it that you think about? Maybe you also are a STEM professional. Maybe you've lived this experience. What are some examples of things that might become barriers for women entering into and persisting and staying within the fields of STEM? I saw one person starting to type a response. I'm going to give you a chance to respond, and we'll move forward. But just want to get those neurons firing and thinking about what is it that you already know about this, or what is it that you already think? All right. Looks like we don't have any participants here, but that's okay. I'm going to tell you how we're going to look at this today. So we're going to, oh, yes, math pathways. Okay, great. Thanks so much for that contribution, Nicole. So when we think about what the literature tells us, I'm going to introduce this to you through a framework of the interlocking 4I model. And so, Elizabeth, if you'll grab that link and resource from the website, then you all can read more about this. But this becomes a really useful tool for helping us to understand the ways in which barriers sort of happen and show up and affect our students. And so this interlocking 4I model it creates both systems of advantage and systems of disadvantage. And so systems of advantage means that it's working towards the benefit of certain groups. So that creates what we call privilege. And systems of disadvantage create barriers that do not give people that privilege, and it becomes systems of oppression. And so when we think about this, so it can either be a system of advantage or a system of disadvantage. When we map what the literature tells us about some of the top root causes for access and success in career and technical education in STEM, it's important to see the ways in which they align with these 4Is. And so I'll tell you what the 4Is as we move forward. But I want to first talk about root causes. So again, we talked about this last time. I'm not going to reteach this lesson. But when we talk about root causes, it's important that we think about what are those core issues, those highest level causes that set in motion the entire cause and effect reaction that ultimately leads to the problem. And so we talked about a couple of weeks ago that we often see those symptoms: participation, performance, persistence of women in STEM and these pathways. We might identify some problems like we think they're not interested, or they're just not aware of these programs. But neither of these things are root causes. We have to get to the bottom of things. We have to get to those initial things that set in motion the the outcomes that we see, right? And so we're going to talk about those today. Now, I already mentioned the term oppression, and that really is how we're going to frame the conversation today. So, oppression is this combination of prejudice and power, which creates a system that can discriminate against some groups and benefits other groups. Examples of these systems are the isms: racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, and anti-Semitism, just to name a few. And so what happens here is there is a dominant group that holds the most power in a given society, while there are what we call subordinate groups or non-dominant groups who lack the power compared to that dominant group. And so the classic sociological definition of a dominant group is a group with power, privileges, and social status. Another related definition is a social group that controls the value systems and rewards in a particular society. So the dominant group is often the majority, but not necessarily. And so systems of oppression, these enable dominant groups to exert control over non-dominant groups by limiting their rights, their freedoms, or access to basic resources such as healthcare, education, employment, and housing. And so there are 4 types of oppression that we're going to talk about today: the ideological, the interpersonal, the institutional, and internalized. These systems overlap and they interact. And these systems are designed by people and upheld by people. So we are all moving through the world, participating in these systems, whether we recognize it or not. We may benefit from these systems, whether we recognize it or not. And so we're going to talk about what that means by watching
oppression.
We're going to watch a really short video that's going to describe these 4 I's for us.
Oppression. It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger, overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access. Who is able to get to what and how? This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the four I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all four of these levels. Thanks for watching.
All right, so her final thing that she said is that we must address oppression at all four levels in order for it to be sustainable and effective. And so that's why we've broken down the root causes into these four I's, because if we just create some kind of intervention that doesn't address it at all four I's, then we're not creating a solution that's really going to get to those core root causes. And what's also important to note about this model is that the ideological, the interpersonal, and the institutional, these are all external forces that are then affecting the internalized beliefs of students and women choosing whether or not to go into STEM. And so we're going to start with ideological. So ideological is the foundation of the four I's. It's the idea that one group is superior to another, and this creates a dominant narrative about a group and an us versus them culture. And so the first root causes here is around stereotypes. So stereotypes, these are widely held but fixed, oversimplified, and generalized images or idea of a particular type of person or thing, including personal traits or circumstantial attributes. And these stereotypes can become ideological beliefs held within one's culture that lead to assumptions about characteristics, behaviors, and social norms. I love the sort of primary quote of the TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called "The Danger of the Single Story." And she says, "The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story." And so when we think about stereotypes and then we sort of combine that with prejudice, so prejudice, this is then that preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So within the field of social psychology, prejudice refers more specifically to attitudes and emotional responses towards a group and its members. So I want you to think about, and I'm going to give some examples as we go along here. Think about what are some of the examples of negative stereotypes about women in STEM. So these negative stereotypes about women in STEM can have significant impacts on their participation and advancement in these fields. And these stereotypes are often rooted in gender biases, and they can discourage women from pursuing STEM careers. They impact their performance and affect the recognition and support that they receive in the field. So some examples of these stereotypes include, and these are stereotypes, right? Doesn't mean they're true. They are stereotypes. They are ideological beliefs. So there's a stereotype, there's a lack of ability. And this is a prevalent stereotype. And it's that women somehow inherently lack mathematical and technical skills required for success in STEM fields. And this can lead to underestimation of women's capabilities by peers, educators, and employers. And so we see this sort of ideological belief that's sort of mapped in like back in around 2000, Mattel released a Barbie that had like you pull her little chain on the back and she says 100 things, and one of the things was math is hard. Or we see t-shirts that say, math's not for me, and it's all a pink shirt, I'd rather be shopping. And I have some examples of those shirts if you'd like to see that are real on the market. And that's a perceived ideology that can be perpetuated in our media. Another example of a stereotype is the perception that they're somehow not naturally suited. And so there is the stereotype that men are more naturally suited to STEM fields due to like inherent interests or abilities, implying that somehow women are less likely to succeed or belong in these areas. I remember my grandma said to me when I was in high school and or finishing high school and choosing my engineering pathway. She's like, women don't become engineers. Like that's a deep ideology, that says that women aren't suited for this. They should do other things. And so this stereotype can discourage girls and women from developing an interest in STEM subjects from a really young age. Other stereotypes might be work-life balance concerns. So women in STEM often face stereotypes related to work-life balance, such as the assumption that they will prioritize family over career, leading to doubts about their long-term commitment to their profession or position. And other stereotypes might be leadership skills. The stereotypes extend to like leadership abilities with assumptions that women are less decisive or authoritative, or stereotypes that women need help, that they might be stereotyped as needing more help or assistance from their male counterparts, undermining their independence and competence, or just personality stereotypes. Women may face stereotypes that they're too emotional or not aggressive enough or too aggressive, when they're actually just being a good leader, for the competitive environments that are often found. So again, these stereotypes, they can contribute to a hostile work environment for women, reinforcing the gender gap in STEM fields. And efforts to combat these stereotypes include promoting female role models in STEM, gender bias training, and creating supportive networks for women in these fields. And so addressing and challenging these stereotypes is crucial for creating more inclusive and equitable STEM environments. And so now let's look at the next of the I's. So these underlying ideologies, these stereotypes, then they begin to manifest in our interpersonal interactions. And so interpersonal interactions are how these ideologies are played out in our daily interactions, either intentionally or unintentionally. And this includes implicit biases, micro-messages, perpetuating or not interrupting stereotypes, or not recognizing power and privilege, or claiming somehow some kind of like reverse, I'm using air quotes here, reverse racism or oppression. And I noticed that my hands are blue. I'm in the middle of a painting project, and I'm out of paint thinner to get all the paint off my hands. So pardon my my splotchy skin here. And so we'll start with bias. So bias, this is, so any kind of expression of prejudice and stereotypes is bias, any expression. And so bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, a person, a group, compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. So as a verb, bias causes one to feel or show inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something in an explicit or implicit ways. And so implicit biases and prejudices are often unrecognized and may not even align to one's declared beliefs or values. And so prejudices, stereotypes, and consequently bias often operate in combination to influence our behavior. And so, as I noted, there are a couple of kinds of bias. We've got explicit bias, and these are attitudes or beliefs or stereotypes that affect one understanding actions and decisions in a conscious manner. So when someone is consciously saying, you don't belong here, so on my first day as an engineer, and I share this story in my TED Talk if you want to hear the full story. But on my first day as a full-time engineer in the same group that I had interned in, I was told by a man, you don't belong here. Like, that's not implicit bias. Like, that's really conscious bias. He said, you were only chosen because you're a pretty little girl. That's a deeply explicit conscious bias that says I don't belong here. Now, then his behavior or any other person's behavior could manifest in really subtle ways. And that is, again, what we call implicit bias. It's when these biases are showing up in these unconscious ways, those microaggressions, micro messages that suggest all along the way whether we belong in a space. Now I'm going to introduce a concept. I'm going to sort of jump forward and then step back. But the next couple of things that we're going to talk about. So when we look at the wheel here, in order for us to understand the impact of role models and mentors and support and feedback and support, we need to know where those are related to. And so those are both sources of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, which is the internalized belief, has external influences. So self-efficacy is a belief in oneself that you can accomplish a task. It answers the question, can I do this? And so we develop self-efficacy by four sources. There's mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and emotional and physiological cues. So mastery experiences are not what we're talking about here, but we're talking about vicarious experiences and social persuasion. So this self-efficacy is rooted in Dr. Albert Bandura's work. He originally published on it in 1987. It's one of the most long-withstanding social learning theories that we understand about performance and behavior. It's not just in education, it's in all realms. But there are four sources of this. And so vicarious experiences, this is the observation of models, that's role models. And social persuasion, that's the feedback and support from others. Those are both external things. So we'll go a little deeper into that later, but here we want to look at and understand how are these numbers 3 and 4 affecting students. So I want to give you an example. So consider a scenario of Maria. She is a talented and ambitious young woman with a strong interest in computer science. Maria's journey through the world of STEM, from education to career, exemplifies how both implicit and explicit biases related to gender stereotype can impact a woman's experience. Oh, sorry, I meant to talk about her story before skipping to role models. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself here. So I want to again demonstrate how bias is playing a role in someone's story. So in the education phase of her life, we've got the implicit bias. So implicit bias shows up during her high school years. Maria notices that her male classmates are often more frequently called upon in her computer science class, even though she and several other female students consistently perform at the top of the class. And this implicit bias from her teacher, who may unconsciously associate technical proficiency with male students, begins to erode Maria's confidence in her abilities. Now, an explicit bias would be Maria's enthusiasm for participating in a robotics competition is met with skepticism by a few of her peers and even a teacher who offhandedly comments that it's unusual for girls to be interested in such things. This explicit expression of stereotypical beliefs directly challenges her sense of belonging in the field. Now, if we take her story forward into college and university level, at university, Maria chooses to major in computer science. She finds herself in a minority with significantly fewer women in her classes. Group project assignments often leave her feeling isolated as her contributions are undervalued or overlooked by the male group members, reflecting an implicit bias that questions her competence based on her gender. Now, an explicit bias would be, an example would be during a career fair, a recruiter from a tech company expresses surprise at Maria's technical knowledge, mentioning that he didn't expect such a deep understanding from a woman. This explicit bias not only undermines her achievements, but also suggests that her gender makes her an anomaly in her field. And so last, I want to look at how bias plays out in her professional career. So an example of implicit bias would be, as Maria advances in her career, she notices that her ideas are sometimes ignored in meetings, only to then be acknowledged when reiterated by a male colleague. How many times has this happened to you? And this pattern, an example of implicit bias, subtly diminishes her contributions and can impact her visibility and opportunities for advancement. Now, explicit bias would be when applying for a leadership position within her company, Maria receives feedback that while her technical skills are outstanding, there are concerns about her fit for a leadership role because she doesn't exhibit the, quote, assertiveness typically seen in their male leaders. This feedback is tinged with explicit bias, conflating leadership qualities with stereotypically masculine traits. And so throughout Maria's journey, this accumulation of biases not only challenges her sense of belonging and competence, but it also requires her to continually prove her worth and confront stereotypes head on. This scenario highlights the pervasive nature of gender biases in STEM and underscores the importance of addressing and mitigating these biases to support and retain women in these fields. Now, again, I apologize, I got my slides a little out of order. So now now that we've talked about the bias and both explicit and implicit, now we're going to talk about the role models and mentors and feedback and support. So, modeling or role modeling is a key strategy that aligns to providing those positive vicarious experiences, one of the four sources of self-efficacy. And so the research has consistently shown that people need to see people who look like them in fields. They need to be able to see it to believe it and to imagine themselves in those fields. And the research tells us that the characteristics of effective role models have these four qualities. One, there's a perceived similarity. The person has credibility. They are enthusiastic. We don't want, somebody who's not enthusiastic about their work. They can't be a great role model for there. And they need to demonstrate competence through effort. And so that means that we're not showing up and saying like, I'm a savant, an excellent engineer, and I've never had to do any hard work here. We want to show the competence through the effort and demonstrating that. So literally modeling the journey, modeling the task. So now let's continue with Maria's story and talk about how a lack of role models in STEM becomes a significant barrier to her journey, impacting her self-efficacy and shaping her experiences from education to her professional career. So early education, as Maria is developing an interest in computer science during her high school years, she searches for women role models in the field who mirror her aspirations and background. However, she finds few examples of Latino women in technology highlighted in her textbooks and discussed in her classes. This lack of perceived similarity makes it challenging for Maria to envision herself succeeding in her career. This absence of role models with whom she can identify undermines her belief in her ability to overcome obstacles and achieve her goals in STEM. Now at university, Maria attends several guest lectures and workshops in hopes of finding inspiration and guidance. While she encounters several accomplished professionals, very few are women, and even fewer are from her Hispanic identity background. Although these individuals are credible and they demonstrate enthusiasm and competence, the lack of perceived similarities in gender and ethnic backgrounds limits their impact as role models for Maria. This gap reinforces her feelings of isolation and exacerbates the challenge of visualizing her own path to success in a predominantly male and non-minority field. And then finally, in her professional pathway, as Maria transitions into her professional career, she continues to face the challenge of finding role models. While she admires the competence and efforts of her senior colleagues, the scarcity of women of color in leadership positions within her company and the broader tech industry make it difficult for her to find mentors who have navigated similar barriers. This lack of role models, again, the lack of role models is not her fault, right? But this lack of role models not only affects her self-efficacy, but also leaves her without a clear roadmap for navigating the unique challenges associated with her intersectional identity in STEM. And so now that we've talked about the role models, I want us to think now about feedback. And so feedback and social persuasion is one of those sources of self-efficacy. So it's messages from the world that are telling you whether you belong or that you are sort of on the right path. And so I've got several resources on my website on like how to give good feedback. And so Elizabeth, if you'd share some of those resources, especially ones on how to give inclusive feedback or give good feedback with inclusivity in mind, that'd be helpful. But we need to hear these messages. So feedback isn't just feedback on like something that you've done. Feedback is also like the messages that you receive. So on my first day of work, when Bill tells me, you don't belong here. You're only hired because you're a little girl. When he is somebody that I had worked with during my master's thesis, and then had to work with, like, that's feedback, right? Like, he is a superior, and I'm receiving this feedback that's telling me you don't belong here, right? But there's also kinds of social persuasion, my grandma telling me, like, this isn't for you. That's feedback, right? It's social persuasion, feedback from people who are in positions of power. And so our words have weight. We want to be encouraging, we want to be supportive, we want to offer words of advice and support that help people to see themselves and envision themselves in these pathways. So next we're going to talk about institutional. This is the last of the external sources. So institutional oppression, this creates a system of invisible barriers that limit people based on their membership in certain social identity groups. And so these barriers are often only invisible to those seemingly unaffected by it. And institutional oppression occurs when established laws, customs, and practices systematically reflect and reproduce inequities based on one's membership in some targeted social identity groups. And so, if oppressive consequences accrue to institutional laws, customs, or practices, the institution is oppressive, whether or not the people maintaining those practices have oppressive intentions. And so the root causes that I've mapped here to institutional oppression are culture and climate, policies and procedures, marketing, intersectionality, and student voice. So let's first look at culture and climate. So so first of all, culture, there we go. So culture, it implies this sort of integrated pattern of human behavior that includes the thoughts, the communications, the actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of a group, right? It's the sort of shared values, the shared way of knowing and doing and being. And so culture, it shapes our beliefs and forms our biases about people based on their age, their gender, their race, language, ability, disability, class, income level, or any other factors, often without our realization. Now, climate, organizational climate, is the way that people experience the work environment. It answers the questions like, what is it like to work here? How do individuals feel when operating in that culture? How do business conditions, management decisions, and the actions of leadership affect the general mood? When you consider the collective experience of all the talent in the organization, you're evaluating climate. So a scenario here, let's think about Emily. So Emily is an engineer at a tech firm, and she often feels isolated in her workplace, which is predominantly male. During team meetings, her suggestions are frequently overlooked, and social events cater to the interest of her male colleagues. This culture subtly signals that women are outsiders, affecting Emily's sense of belonging and diminishing her motivation to contribute fully or pursue leadership roles within her field. This climate of exclusion represents a form of institutional oppression, making it challenging for women like Emily to persist in STEM careers. So another source of institutional oppression are policies and procedures. So we'll start with a scenario here. So Anita applies for a research grant at her university, only to find that the criteria for evaluation heavily favor projects led by those with previous grants, a group predominantly composed of her male peers. So this policy indirectly perpetuates a cycle where women and other underrepresented groups in STEM find it harder to obtain funding, limiting their opportunities for advancement and contribution to their fields. So such institutional barriers as this, such institutional policies act as barriers, reinforcing gender disparities in STEM. So other policies and procedures could be your recruitment and hiring practices, your tenure and promotion criteria, your leave policies. So any kind of policy that's put into place that could disproportionately affect women is institutionalized oppression that affects women. In addition to this is sort of tied to policies and procedures and certainly connected to culture and climate are the sort of norms and ways of knowing and doing. So whether you're scheduling things at a time that might disproportionately affect women. So if women need to pick up their kids at 3:30 and you keep scheduling meetings at 3:30, that is a normative barrier that's affecting potentially disproportionately women who may be needing to pick up their children. Or lab in the meeting culture. So if you have a culture that tolerates or ignores sexist jokes and comments and behaviors, it creates an unwelcoming environment for women. And this not only affects day-to-day work, but it also discourages their long-term participation in STEM. We also see this in like peer review and publication bias. We see it in the credit and recognition norms, and then in networking opportunities. So addressing these institutional barriers requires a concerted effort to revise policies, procedures, and norms to ensure that they support inclusivity and equity. The next root cause is our marketing messages. So these are the messages that we use, so the imagery and the sort of efforts that we employ. So an example might be when high school student Lisa visits a college fair, she notices that the promotional materials for the engineering program feature predominantly male students and faculty. The messaging emphasizes competition over collaboration, which does not resonate with her collaborative approach to problem solving. This marketing approach contributes to the perception that STEM fields are not welcoming or suited to women, discouraging potential students like Lisa from pursuing STEM education and careers. So the next root cause is intersectionality. So intersectionality, by definition, is the interconnected nature of social categorizations that create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage. So this is a way of looking at like, I am not just a woman, I am a white woman. So my experiences as a white woman are going to be distinctly different than the experiences of white women. I am in the process of adopting a child. So she's going to be moving, she's foster to adopt. And this beautiful child is mixed race. And I am distinctly aware of intersectionality and recognizing that her experiences as a biracial young woman are going to be distinctly different than mine. It would be a grand mistake to assume that just because she's a young woman who will grow up in the same community that I grew up in, that her experiences will be the same, because they won't be. It's because these interlapping systems of racism and sexism and all of these things, those systems overlap and affect the experiences of people. And so intersectionality, it looks at things like race, gender, socioeconomic status, age, sexual orientation, religion, faith, ability or disability, your documentation status of citizenship, your ethnicity, language, physical attributes, and your past trauma. So an example here would be a woman of color studying computer science experiences compounded biases that her white female and male counterparts do not face. So in addition to gendered biases, gendered assumptions about her abilities, she also encounters racial stereotypes within her academic program and internship. And so this intersectionality of gender and race creates a unique set of challenges for the student, making it harder for her to find mentorship, networking opportunities, and a supportive community within STEM. I've got another short little video that describes intersectionality that I want you to watch. And this is important because this word has been lost in the zeitgeist and really kind of captured in a way that has lost its original intent and what it means. And so I'd like to provide any opportunity I can to clarify this. So watch this short little video here.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
Another key thing to consider when thinking about intersectionality is also a critical data analysis challenge. And this is why I put it at the institutional level, is that if we aren't analyzing data that's disaggregated by the combinations of gender and race or gender and some other identity, then we can't fully understand the experiences of the students that we're serving. Because if we just disaggregate data by gender, we can say, okay, sure, they seem to be doing fine enough. But it's not until we disaggregate the data by gender and race might we not begin to sort of reveal and uncover inequities that we need to understand and address. So the last root cause that's connected to institutional is student voice. And student voice is about asking students to contribute to solving the problems that affect them. And so if we aren't engaging student voice into our problem solving and addressing some of these barriers, then we don't really fully understand how to serve them. So an example might be in a university engineering program, a feedback session is held to improve the curriculum. However, so that's good intent, right? The good intent is to offer the session. However, the voices of female students like Priya are overshadowed by those of her male peers, leading to recommendations that largely reflect the male perspective and fail to address specific needs or concerns of women in the program. And so this lack of representation in student feedback processes can perpetuate a curriculum and a learning environment that does not fully support or engage women, contributing to higher attrition rates among female students in STEM. So all of these scenarios that I've shared around the institutional, they illustrate how institutional barriers and oppression create and maintain systemic inequities in STEM, affecting women's entry into and persistence within these fields. And so addressing these challenges requires conscious efforts to reform culture, policies, marketing strategies, and curricula to be more inclusive and supportive of women and other represented groups in STEM. So now we are at the internalized element. So all the other things that we've talked about are external influences, but all of these externalized ideas can become internalized and affect how we move forward within these pathways. And so it's so critical that you recognize that oppression always begins from the outside of the oppressed group. But by the time it gets internalized, that external oppression need hardly be felt because the damage has already been done. And so if people from the oppressed group feel badly about themselves, and because of the nature of the system, they don't have the power to direct those feelings back towards the dominant group without receiving more blows, then there are only two places to dump those feelings: on oneself and on the people in the same group. So examples of internalized oppression could be feelings of self-hate or believing the negative messaging, feeling powerless, and experiencing despair. And the key root cause here is self-determination. We're going to talk about what kind of goes into self-determination. So self-determination is each person's ability to make choices and manage their own life. And we've got some sort of contributing elements to self-determination. And so first is one that I already intimated about earlier, and that's self-efficacy, the belief in oneself that you can accomplish a task. Again, it answers that question, can I do this? And so self-efficacy is important because high self-efficacy predicts academic achievement, whereas high self-esteem does not. So self-esteem is different than self-efficacy. Self-esteem answers that question, how do I feel about myself? It's one's beliefs and feelings about being a worthy and valued individual, and it refers to all aspects of oneself, not just to specific skills or qualities. So I cannot like myself, but have a high self-efficacy, and that predicts my achievement more so than self-esteem. And self-efficacy is important because it has a high self-efficacy. High self-efficacy gives greater achievement, interest, motivation, engagement, persistence, and performance, whereas a low self-efficacy means that students and people are more likely to doubt, fear, and avoid tasks. So again, self-efficacy has external sources, and it has, in some bodies of literature, been proven to be one of the most influential sources of women choosing to enter into and persist in STEM. But again, it's not just on them, it's on the system that's led them to believe these things, right? So the next sort of part of self-determination is mindset. So mindset is a self-perception that people hold about themselves, which affects how they approach tasks. And so it's answering that question, can I improve with effort? I like to draw on Carol Dweck's work of fixed and growth mindset. And so again, this sort of perceptions that people hold about how they approach tasks, and you can either have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. A fixed mindset is a belief that your intelligence, your ability, and personality are static and that nothing can be done to change it. Whereas a growth mindset is a belief that your intelligence, your ability, and your personality can be developed and can change and improve with effort. Now, I encourage you to read more about mindset, and surely you've got some resources on my website that we can share for both of these elements. Elizabeth, if you want to share the links to some to self-efficacy, and if you can find something on the website on mindset, that'd be great. But again, these are influenced by external sources. There's some literature that talks about how in a matter of one class period, if you change as an educator how you provide feedback, it builds a growth mindset, which predicts greater achievement in a task than if you give intelligence-based feedback. So again, really fascinating. One of my favorite tools for creating fast change in students. And then the last element of self-determination, the influencing factor, is stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is a socially premised psychological threat that arises when one is in a situation or doing something which is for which a negative stereotype about one's group applies. So there's two things that have to happen for stereotype threat to be activated. One, you have to care about what you're doing, and two, there has to be a stereotype against you in that pathway. So there's this, I love this Jorge Cham comic strip here. And the first panel, you see a young woman sitting between two young men, and she has this thought bubble, and it says, "Wait a minute, I'm the only female in this class." And then it zooms in on her. "It's okay, no pressure, just be yourself. No pressure at all. I'm just." And then she sort of yells "ah" out loud, thinking, "I'm only representing all of womankind." And then she goes and puts her head on her desk, and it says "engineering 1, womankind 0." And then the guys perceive this as, "oh, she's a ditch, she's psycho." And so stereotype threat is real, and it's hard to understand if you don't experience it. But I distinctly remember this. I remember being the only female in a class of 70 male students. I'm in a program called Women in Engineering, trying to get more women to become engineers. And this is an unconscious labor. It's an unconscious sort of weight that you carry, because it's telling me, like, I represent all women. If I fail in this Women in Engineering program that's specifically designed to help me succeed, somehow I'm going to represent that all women can't become engineers. And so it answers this sort of phrase, "I can't fail or mess up because I might validate the stereotype that I can't fail or mess up in this class because I might validate the stereotype that women don't become engineers," or whatever. I like this quote from Sidney Poitier. This came out right, or I learned it right after he passed away. He said, "I was the only Black person on the set. It was unusual for me to be in a circumstance in which every move I made was tantamount, excuse me, to the representation of 18 million people." So as an early actor, he's saying here that it felt like everything that he did was representing the entire Black race. And that is stereotype threat, because this weight is a cognitive load that affects your ability to perform in a space. And so when you are carrying the sort of unconscious weight of this, it affects your performance. So we've wrapped up now. We've gone through the top 10 root causes related to the 4 I's. And remember, it's so critical that we begin to address all 4 of these. We begin to address these at all 4 levels. So say that you create a mentoring program, but you don't create a mentoring program that's equipping the mentors to overcome their own stereotypes and biases and making them aware of those and how to reduce those. You're not equipping those role models and mentors with the tools to give feedback that's going to support them. If you're not simultaneously addressing some of the culture and climate of that. So again, like, you just want to think about, how am I, in whatever intervention that you're choosing, addressing it at all 4 levels. Now, as promised, we've come to the end of the first hour. And so I want to offer, I don't see any questions on the Slido poll, but this is a great time if you want to offer up any kinds of questions that are based on what we've talked about, maybe based on your specific needs and the students that you serve. So tell us what questions that you might have. And while you're sort of garnering those questions, I want to remind you about some opportunities. So simultaneously right now, Engineer Inclusion is running a series for featuring women in STEM. We had our first one last week. And so Elizabeth's going to grab the link. It's free, virtual. We will offer the recordings. They'll be available soon, but you're welcome to participate and invite all of the future women in STEM or current women in STEM, or you don't have to be a woman to attend, but I encourage you to join us for this Women in STEM series. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about persistence and failure in STEM. So not only what those things mean for innovation, but also for our professional lives and the career. And so I encourage you to join us in that tomorrow. Thanks for that, Elizabeth. Now, again, I encourage you to capture the chat, because Elizabeth has shared a lot of great resources. And so certainly you can save the I think you should be able to save the chat. If not, just Control A, Control C. What questions do you have related to your work? Any questions about the barriers and root causes that we've talked about? Well, if you haven't already, I encourage you to join our mailing list because I like to send lots of great resources. At least we try one a week to send resources that help you improve your practice around equity and inclusion. And certainly given my own experience as a woman in STEM, I do tend to have lots of resources that are specifically related to that. Before you go today, I encourage you to think about what's something that you've learned, 3 things that you've learned, maybe consider 2 things that you'll do differently. And what's an immediate action item that you want to take away from what you've learned today? So take a minute to reflect on 3 things that you've learned, 2 immediate action, 2 things that you want to do differently, and 1 immediate action item. Take a minute to reflect. Now we'll give you a chance to share your action item or something else momentarily. Encourage you to add those in the chat if you'd like. So I want to come back to something Nicole added in the chat. So she talked about math pathways being a big hurdle, and what's important to note here is that the research tells us that girls take just as many math and science classes and have slightly higher GPAs in math and science than boys do, but yet they think they're not good at math. And so this actually connects back to stereotype threat. And so it connects back to lots of self-determination. And it goes back to all of those sort of external messages that become internalized. And so certainly within some schools, they may have greater access to math courses and curricula. But what's so fascinating about, and the researchers bear this out for decades, but it's called attribution theory. And so girls and women could be better at math than boys, but not think so if they make a 98 or something. So if they make a 98, they're more likely to attribute it to their overall math ability, whereas boys and men are more likely to attribute it to like some sort of external influence. And so again, all of this is because of the deep conditioning we have around our gendered identities. What's also proving deeply frustrating is that 15 years ago, when I started doing my dissertation research, the research showed that girls started opting out of math and meaning not believing that math was for them around 5th grade. The research shows now, almost 15 years later, that girls are making that decision as early as 3rd grade. And what I mean is they're saying math's not for me, even though they still go on to take as many math and science classes and still have, equivalent math and science GPAs. Those messages that are so pervasive in our media and our society, those underlying ideologies, it's impacting that self-internalized belief of this is not for me. And so again, that number is not getting better, it is getting worse, and it's getting earlier and earlier. All right, I want to invite you to, again, you can share your ideas in the chat. And I want to thank you for your time. We value your feedback and can improve our services, especially because we'll be meeting with you for the next couple of time, over the next month. You can request a certificate for your time today, and Brittany may also offer something like that. But again, we really value your feedback. On the same page, you can join our mailing list. So if you'll go to that QR code, you can evaluate the session, request a certificate, and join the mailing list. And again, you can unsubscribe at any time, but you get weekly resources that are valuable to you and to your work.